What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I remember the exact moment when I decided I was done, not in a symbolic way, not in one of those casual threats you toss around during a family argument, but in a bone-deep, final sort of way that leaves no door cracked open for reconciliation. My mother was on the other end of the line, her voice sharp but casual, like she was commenting on the weather rather than slicing me in half with words I had heard too many times before. "You need to understand," she said, "your brothers come first. They're building futures. They're the ones who will carry this family forward. You'll manage." She didn't say I mattered less, but she didn't have to. She never had to. It was always written in the way holidays were planned around their schedules, the way the best food was saved for them at dinner, the way birthdays came with cars and tuition checks while mine came with a sweater that looked suspiciously like it had been on clearance. I sat there on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and I realized I had been swallowing this same bitter pill my entire life. When I was 10, my younger brother Matthew got a brand new bike with metallic blue paint and shiny chrome spokes, while I inherited a rusty pink one from a neighbor's yard sale. When I was 15 and begged to join a summer program for kids who wanted to write, my parents told me it was too expensive and impractical. That same summer, my older brother Jason was flown across the country for a baseball camp, and no one blinked at the cost. By the time I reached college, I didn't even bother to ask for help with tuition. I worked 2 jobs, piecing together enough to survive, while my brothers had their rent, textbooks, and even their groceries covered. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the constant message that I was supposed to understand, to be the flexible one, the one who needed less, the one who could manage. "You're strong," my mother would say, as if strength was some magical currency that could pay for textbooks or therapy. "Your brothers need more guidance." I told myself I could live with that being independent was its own kind of reward. But over the years the resentment stacked up like unpaid bills, every slight folded into another, until I had built a wall so tall I couldn't see daylight over it anymore. On that particular night, her words cut deeper than usual, because I had been counting on her to show up differently. I had just been offered a promotion at work, one that meant relocating and finally having some financial breathing room, and all I wanted was the faintest sliver of pride from her. Instead, she pivoted immediately into how Jason's new business idea needed seed money and how Matthew was considering grad school, so everyone in the family had to pitch in, meaning me. When I reminded her that I had my own bills, my own future, she laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, the way you laugh at a child who insists they're old enough to drive. That laugh became the moment. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't even argue. I just let the silence stretch long enough for her to ask if I was still there. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice calm in a way that startled even me. "I'm here. I just don't think I will be anymore." Before she could ask what that meant, before she could reel me back in with guilt or manipulation, I hung up. My hand shook, but not from fear. From something heavier, something closer to relief. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was immediate. My phone lit up with messages from my parents, my aunts, even distant cousins, all of them armed with variations of the same script. "Family is everything. Don't let pride ruin blood ties. Your brothers need you, and one day you'll need them." Not a single message asked if I was okay, if I was tired of carrying the weight, if I ever felt seen. They didn't want me, not really. They wanted what I could provide, the stability, the unpaid therapist, the fallback babysitter, the reliable one who never made trouble. And now that I had pulled the plug, they treated it like I had murdered the family bond with my own hands. I thought cutting them off would give me peace, that walking away would leave me lighter. And in a way, it did. The silence after years of obligation felt like a drug. I stopped checking my phone compulsively, stopped rearranging my schedule for their emergencies, stopped feeling like my existence was just filler in a story where my brothers were the main characters. But peace is never that simple, not in families like mine. Because when someone like me dares to put down the burden, the ones who benefited most don't just shrug and move on. They panic. They scramble. They rage. At first it was just calls and texts I could ignore, then guilt-soaked voicemails, then relatives showing up at my job just to talk. But when the knocking started at my door, sharp and insistent, I knew something had shifted. They weren't coming to scold me anymore. They were coming with a different kind of hunger. And the sickest part? I wasn't scared. I was curious. Because if my whole life had been about them taking, maybe it was time for me to find out what it looked like when they started losing. The first week after I hung up on my mother felt like walking through a house after a storm, the air strangely clean and a little too quiet, with every familiar object still in place yet shifted by the knowledge that something big had finally moved and would not be moving back, and while my phone kept pulsing on the table like a stubborn heartbeat, I refused to resuscitate. I discovered a patience in myself I did not know I had, the kind that lets you observe chaos without stepping into it. Simply because you have finally realized the chaos was never yours to begin with. They tried every angle the family handbook could offer, beginning with nostalgia-soaked messages about childhood memories that never existed in the form they remembered, continuing with frantic bulletins about how Jason's business needed just a little bridge loan and how Matthew's grad school pivot had become a time-sensitive opportunity that any loving sister would support, and then shifting into the darker gravity of obligation, the kind that drags on old bones and says family isn't about fairness, it's about sacrifice, preferably yours, ideally forever. When I did not answer the calls, the voicemails turned into short monologues performed by people who forgot they were talking to a grown woman with a job and a spine, and I let them pile up because there was a forensic pleasure in hearing, side by side, the casual entitlement that once sounded like air and now sounded like the creaking of a ceiling fan you know will fall if someone tugs the chain one more time, and the longer I waited the less tempted I felt to correct their rewrites of our history, which had somehow upgraded my childhood into a parade of equal treatment and identical chances despite photographic evidence of carbos and cross-country camps that never found their way to my calendar. They tried relatives as emissaries, and an aunt texted to say I was overreacting in a tone that made me wonder how many emergencies I had solved for her while she called me dramatic, and a cousin I barely knew called me the responsible one. In the same breath, she asked if I could float a month of rent for Jason, which made me laugh out loud in my kitchen, an unbeautiful sound that startled me with how tired and free it felt at once. The knocking began on a Saturday afternoon when the sky had that bleached, empty look that turns the neighborhood silent, and I stood on the other side of the door staring at the peephole, watching the distorted silhouettes of people who once treated me like furniture and were now performing politeness on my welcome mat, as if the act itself could rewind time to the era when my no was a decorative opinion and not an actual barrier. I did not open the door that first time, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to feel what it was like to choose myself without explanation, and the feeling, surprisingly, was not mean or cold, it was calm. Like putting down a bag after carrying it for far too many blocks while telling yourself the straps didn't really hurt. That evening, because I have learned that silence is a tool but clarity is a weapon, I sat at my desk and wrote the kind of message you only write once in a family like mine, the kind that reads like a weather report until you notice the numbers and recognize a hurricane, and I sent it to the group chat and copied every adult in the family, not to humiliate anyone but to stop pretending I was speaking into a private room when the expectations had always been crowd-sized. In patient, measured paragraphs, I listed the milestones that had been framed as fair while costing me years of sleep and savings. From the summer I was denied the writing program because it was impractical, to the fall when Jason's rent mysteriously attached itself to my debit card because he was between paychecks, from the winter when I covered Matthew's textbooks, just this once, to the spring when my tax return vanished into a family emergency fund that transfused itself directly into a luxury purchase we all pretended was medicinal. I did not accuse or insult, I itemized, and at the end I included a simple, almost cheerful note that, moving forward, any requests for assistance would need to be submitted through a brief form I attached, a neat little document titled, without sarcasm, Request for Assistance, Financial Responsibility Addendum, which asked for exactly the kind of information adults provide when they are serious, a breakdown of income and expenses, a summary of Recent discretionary spending, a list of assets that could be liquidated before invoking my name, and a commitment to a repayment schedule that did not rely on miracles or memory loss. Because I have a sense of humor that rarely gets to wear nice clothes, I added one final line under terms, an optional clause that read like a shrug and stung like a bee. Acknowledgement that prior family communications may have undervalued the undersigned's contributions. A simple written apology is acceptable as collateral. And then I hit send and watched the message jump from my laptop into the nest where stories are retold and alliances calcify, and I felt that clean quiet again. Not triumph exactly, but the relief of choosing rules after a lifetime of being told none applied to you. This was my revenge for the day. Not loud or theatrical, but exquisitely tailored, because if they were going to treat my life like a bank, then they could learn the cost of walking into one without paperwork. And if they were going to treat history like a foggy photograph, then they could learn how sharp the picture becomes when dates and amounts and signatures line the border. By morning, the group chat looked like a dropped tray of glasses, with messages shattering over one another, indignation competing with denial, and a few quiet notes from relatives who had always been kind but cautious, each of them writing versions of "I didn't know," which is what people say when they knew enough to benefit and not enough to intervene. And while I made coffee, I read every word and then closed my phone like a book you finish not because you loved it, but because you finally understood the plot. The knocking returned that afternoon, steadier this time, and when I lifted the chain and opened the door just enough to meet my mother's eyes, I noticed she was holding my form, neatly printed, with a pen clipped to the corner and a stack of envelopes tucked beneath it, which meant they had come armed with numbers and stories and perhaps even apologies, or, more likely, a fresh plan to leverage the language of responsibility without ever touching its meaning. And while I held the door, I smiled in a way that said nothing and everything, because I had already decided that the only way this ended was on my terms. She took a breath, the practiced inhale that precedes a speech, and I felt the rest of them gathering behind her like a tide. But then a voice from the sidewalk cut through the porch air, a voice I knew too well and had not heard in months. Calm and bureaucratic and somehow intimate at the same time, introducing himself as an agent serving notice on a delinquent account and confirming my address as the designated contact for questions, and as my mother's face flipped through a deck of meanings, trying to find the right one, I realized they had brought their mess to my doorstep on the very day someone else had chosen this address for theirs, and the look we exchanged in that thin slice of silence held enough electricity to power the rest of the week. Because if they believed they could knock and be let in by habit, they were about to learn what it feels like when the hinges are attached to a different frame entirely. The day they finally showed up at my door, the morning had that peculiar clarity where every detail is sharply etched against the light, and I watched from my window as my mother stepped out of the car first. Her posture exaggeratedly proper as though she were attending some ceremonial event, followed by Jason, whose shoulders carried the weight of entitlement and stress in equal measure, and Matthew, who looked as though he had been rehearsing innocence in the mirror for the past 30 minutes, all of them moving with the kind of synchronization that only comes from years of rehearsed familial scripts, and I realized in that moment that they had arrived not simply to speak, but to perform. To remind me that I had once belonged to a narrative they were still attempting to control. They rang the bell, and I watched the door vibrate under their insistence, a dull drumbeat of expectation, and when I opened it, just enough to peer at them without committing to engagement, I noted immediately how the subtle cues of panic had replaced the casual confidence they had always wielded like a shield. Their faces carried the tension of people who had counted on someone else's compliance for too long and were now confronted with its absence. And in that absence, their world had begun to fracture in ways they could not yet fully articulate. I invited them inside, not out of kindness, but curiosity, and as they stepped past the threshold, I could feel the shift in power almost physically, as though the air itself was bracing for a storm that had been building for years. And I allowed myself a measured glance at each of them, noting the micro-expressions of guilt, anxiety, and disbelief that flickered across their faces before they could settle into their familiar performance of entitlement. My mother began first, her voice softening into an almost pleading cadence, explaining how Jason's investments had faltered, how Matthew's tuition plans had been sabotaged by market fluctuations, and how all of it had accumulated into a series of temporary setbacks that required immediate assistance. And I listened, nodding occasionally, allowing the words to fill the space while mentally cataloging every inconsistency, every exaggeration, every omission, because I had long ago learned that their narratives were constructed to manipulate, not to inform, and the clarity that gave me pause was also the clarity that gave me leverage. As Jason fumbled with documents that were supposed to prove financial strain, his frustration growing with each page, I noted the absurdity in the meticulous detail of his excuses, from luxury purchases that had been business investments to bills labeled mysteriously under ambiguous categories, and Matthew interjected occasionally with a tone of wounded innocence, as if his mismanagement were a crime committed by circumstances rather than choices, and my mother's attempts to orchestrate the dialogue only highlighted the desperation beneath their polished exterior, which was exactly the atmosphere I had been waiting to witness, because it revealed the very cracks I could exploit without lifting a finger beyond observation. While they spoke, I allowed myself the space to reflect on the years they had demanded my compliance, the milestones I had missed while being told that their needs were more pressing, the vacations I had foregone while financing their whims, the constant balancing of empathy against disregard that had left me exhausted yet invisible, and the knowledge that this moment of confrontation, while outwardly about money and necessity, was intrinsically about recognition, about proving through action that my life, my choices, and my boundaries were not negotiable, and in that quiet, steady understanding, I realized that their presence in my home had already shifted the equilibrium of authority, whether they knew it or not. They were expecting compromise, the sort that would reaffirm their dominion over my attention and resources, and I entertained the illusion for long enough to keep them guessing, nodding in rhythm with their explanations, asking pointed questions about repayment plans and prior expenditures, feigning concern while simultaneously cataloging the missteps, inconsistencies, and exaggerated claims. Each query serving as a subtle reminder that I was no longer the obedient participant in their ongoing performance. My mother's voice wavered when I asked about their previous attempts to involve me in these matters without my consent, and for the first time, she seemed at a loss. Confronted with the realization that her habitual leverage had been nullified by my refusal to comply, and the weight of years of expectation shifted onto their shoulders in a way that was almost cinematic in its inevitability, creating an atmosphere where their panic was palpable yet unspeakable, because I had not yet revealed the full extent of my preparation, the intricate ways I had insulated my independence, while they scrambled to reclaim a sense of control. The tension rose as I finally mentioned, almost casually, that I had been reviewing their records, their debts, and their expenditures for some time, and that while I understood the pressures they faced, any assistance going forward would require formal documentation, full transparency, and legally binding agreements, a statement delivered in a tone so neutral that the words themselves struck like ice, forcing them to confront that their usual tactics of manipulation would not suffice. And as they sat there processing the implications, fumbling for responses that would normally compel compliance, I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation, knowing that in this calculated moment of observation, the balance had finally begun to tilt in my favor, and the power they had once wielded with such ease was now tentative, awkward, and wholly dependent on my discretion. I watched their expressions carefully, noting how hope, fear, and disbelief mingled across their faces in patterns that revealed more than words ever could, and in that space, I understood that their visit, born of necessity and panic, had become an unwitting admission that the years of taking for granted were over, that the person they had underestimated for decades was now capable of delineating boundaries with precision, and that any attempt to reclaim control would require strategies I was fully prepared to enforce. And while they rearranged their assumptions about me and our family dynamic, I poured tea into delicate cups that had once been ceremonial, now merely instruments in a rehearsal of patience and observation. And as I set the tray before them, I allowed a small, measured smile to cross my face, because the first moves of my quiet, deliberate revenge were already unfolding under the guise of civility, and in that unfolding, the story they had written without my consent was finally subject to my interpretation. The days following their unexpected visit became a delicate dance, an intricate balance of observation, subtle manipulation, and the quiet assertion of boundaries I had spent decades learning to enforce without confrontation. And as I watched my mother, Jason, and Matthew navigate my home with a mixture of entitlement and apprehension, I felt the long-suppressed satisfaction of knowing that for the first time, the weight of expectation had shifted squarely onto their shoulders, requiring them to justify, explain, and negotiate in ways they had never anticipated, because their entire familial strategy had relied upon my automatic compliance, and now compliance was neither guaranteed nor desired, transforming routine interaction into a tense negotiation where every word, gesture, and pause carried consequences they were only beginning to grasp. I allowed them to speak first, encouraging their narratives of hardship and financial strain, each story meticulously structured to elicit sympathy while masking mismanagement, and I listened intently, nodding in apparent understanding, but internally cataloging every discrepancy and illogical allocation, noting how Jason described luxury purchases as necessary investments with a straight face, while Matthew claimed educational expenses were mounting faster than anticipated due to unforeseen fees, and my mother's interjections attempted to anchor their stories in moral obligation, framing me as the responsible one who could mitigate disaster if only I were willing, a pattern I had witnessed countless times in my life, but which now served as a blueprint for the subtle recalibration of power, because the more they expected immediate acquiescence, the more leverage I had to shape the outcome. I began asking questions, deliberately detailed and methodical, not out of skepticism alone, but as a strategic exercise designed to make them fully articulate what they had hoped I would absorb passively, pressing gently on inconsistencies, requesting documentation, and asking them to consider alternatives that had never occurred to them because their experience had conditioned them to assume my compliance. And as the dialogue unfolded, I noticed the shift in posture, in tone, and in the tightness of their expressions, evidence that my neutral but probing approach was eroding the foundation of confidence they had taken for granted, forcing them to engage with me as an equal rather than a subordinate, and for the first time in decades, the scripts they had memorized for manipulating the family dynamic were unraveling in real time, exposing vulnerability that was both satisfying and revealing. As they presented their cases for assistance, I maintained a careful balance, nodding at appropriate moments, interjecting clarifying questions, and occasionally pausing to allow the weight of my silence to emphasize the gravity of the discussion. Because silence in this context became a tool of subtle intimidation, a reminder that my engagement was conditional and that my previous role as the passive observer of their entitlement was no longer available, and while they attempted to predict my response, offering partial solutions, partial apologies, and fragments of accountability, I held the narrative, steering the conversation toward explicit commitments, formalized repayment structures, and the acknowledgement of past imbalances, framing each requirement not as punitive, but as the standard operating procedure any adult would expect in such circumstances, which in itself served as a quiet yet powerful form of revenge. I observed how their attempts at emotional leverage faltered under the weight of my measured, rational responses, how my calm insistence on transparency and accountability undermined the guilt trips and pleas for immediate assistance they had prepared, and how my mother's attempts to reassert moral authority were gradually replaced with frantic recalibration, as if she were learning for the first time that authority without recognition and respect was impotent, and I relished the subtle irony that years of taking my compliance for granted had now forced them into a position where they had to negotiate, justify, and strategize to obtain a fraction of what they had once demanded without question. Over the course of that afternoon, I allowed them to believe they might secure some form of resolution, engaging with their explanations, exploring potential repayment scenarios, and pretending to consider partial compromises. all while maintaining an internal map of leverage and control that guaranteed their efforts would yield only what I permitted, because I had spent years building independence, and any reward they might claim now would be determined entirely by my terms, not by habitual assumption or familial coercion. And in this meticulous orchestration, I discovered not only the power of patience, but also the elegance of revenge delivered with precision, invisibly, yet unmistakably impactful, where the realization that their familiar mechanisms of dominance no longer applied became the most effective and satisfying lesson I could teach. By the time they left, carrying with them the illusion that a negotiation had occurred and that their issues had been partially acknowledged, I had already calculated the next steps, ensuring that all documents were formalized, all boundaries reinforced, and all leverage retained, so that when the next knock inevitably came, I would stand not as the compliant daughter who had been expected to absorb every failure, but as the architect of my own narrative, a position of strength and clarity that they could neither challenge nor comprehend. And in that moment, the quiet satisfaction of mastery, coupled with the anticipation of the final resolution, settled in my chest like a slow, steady flame, warming and illuminating the path that had long been obscured by their demands and expectations, promising an ending that they could not dictate, control, or anticipate. The final confrontation arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the years of tension and manipulation had been building toward this moment without anyone acknowledging the inevitability, and I watched them settle into my living room, still carrying the faint arrogance of entitlement that had been trained into them over decades, their eyes darting around, scanning the space as though it could provide them with an escape route or a hidden lever to manipulate, but all they found was a calm, deliberate order, a household ruled by boundaries and accountability, where the authority they had assumed for themselves no longer existed, replaced by a patient, deliberate force that demanded their attention and respect on terms they had never been required to meet before. My mother began, her tone clipped with the practiced subtlety of someone used to framing every discussion as morally weighted, speaking quickly about debts, obligations, and the sudden reality of life crashing in on her sons. And while she hoped her words would elicit pity or immediate compliance, I listened with the precision of someone cataloging evidence, parsing each syllable for truth and omission, noting the small discrepancies between what she claimed and what records had already shown. While Jason and Matthew, caught between frustration and disbelief, alternated between excuses and attempts to charm, unaware that their usual strategies were irrelevant in a space where I controlled both the dialogue and the conditions under which it could be accepted, and the realization that their performance was now an audience for me alone, rather than a negotiation to compel action, filled me with a measured satisfaction that I allowed to linger without expression, letting the tension accumulate into a palpable weight they could feel but not name. I finally spoke, not in anger, not in triumph, but with a measured clarity that forced them to confront the consequences of their assumptions, reminding them that all the years of expectation, of unacknowledged labor, of compliance extracted as though it were a birthright, had been catalogued and preserved, and that the protection they had once relied upon in my absence was a tool they could no longer access because I had insulated myself legally, financially, and emotionally from their influence. And as the words fell, it became apparent that for the first time, the impact of my autonomy was registering, producing a combination of shock and disbelief that neither arguments nor apologies could erase, leaving a space in the room that was dominated not by them, but by the evidence of preparation, foresight, and the careful cultivation of independence they had never considered necessary. I handed them the envelope, heavy with both symbolism and substance, and allowed them the slow, deliberate process of realizing its contents without commentary, watching their expressions shift as the facts within became clear: contracts, financial separations, legal documents affirming my assets, and detailed accounts of prior interactions that clearly delineated responsibility and obligation, leaving them no leverage, no claim, and no pathway to the immediate satisfaction of entitlement they had relied upon all these years, and as they rifled through the contents, searching for an angle, a loophole, or a justification, it became increasingly clear that the power dynamic they had always assumed had been irrevocably inverted, leaving them exposed to the consequences of their assumptions while I maintained full control over the narrative and the outcome, a reality I allowed to settle in the room before offering a measured, final remark that neither humored nor chastised but crystallized. The lesson: my autonomy was neither negotiable nor reversible, and all expectations predicated on compliance were null. Their faces changed in stages, first confusion, then disbelief, followed by frustration, and finally, a reluctant acknowledgement of reality. But I did not soften, did not temper my delivery. Because the years of extraction and dismissal had created a debt of attention, respect, and consequence that could not be forgiven lightly, and the satisfaction I derived was not from cruelty, but from a precise, deliberate assertion of self. An act of reclamation that required no dramatic flourish, no shaming spectacle, only the cold, inevitable clarity of established boundaries, reinforced by documents and strategy, leaving them to contend with their own assumptions and failures without the ability to redirect, negotiate, or manipulate. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, the atmosphere was taut with a mixture of anger, confusion, and an unspoken realization that nothing would be the same, that the roles had shifted irrevocably, and that any future attempt to assert control over me would require acknowledgement of the very autonomy they had spent a lifetime undermining. And as the door closed behind them, the finality of the moment settled like a tangible weight in the room, a quiet testament to the power of preparation, foresight, and deliberate action, leaving me alone with the relief and satisfaction of independence, the subtle pleasure of revenge exercised with precision rather than impulse, and the understanding that while they may return, the conditions of their engagement had been rewritten entirely, and in that rewriting, I had achieved a clarity and liberation that no amount of familial expectation could erode, allowing me, for the first time in a lifetime, to define my life on my terms, without apology, interference, or concession.